Hello, everyone. Welcome to another special edition of In the Cordon podcast. My name is Callum Dunk. Joining me on the show today is Dade. Today's episode is brought to you by ORTC Clothing Company, as well as Ray White Henley Beach, who have just jumped on board as one of our sponsors. So, Lewis, thank you so much for joining me, mate. How are you going?
Yeah, not too bad. It's been a while since we've been in the cordon together, but I'm happy to be here and looking forward to talking about was a pretty nice win for Australia overall in the series.
Yeah, absolutely, mate. We were in the slip cordon together for a fair few games, but I reckon there's probably only one or two catches between us in that time, and I probably dropped a fair few of them. Lewis, the Aussies were able to get up in the series, as you mentioned, 2-1, which is a very pleasing result after losing the Test series. So we lost the first game in Mumbai. India chased that down with 5 wickets in hand. We were able to get a 10-wicket win in Vizag. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. And Australia was able to win by 21 runs in Chennai in the third ODI. Funny thing about that third ODI, no batsman for Australia reached 50 and we were still able to get a score above 250, 260, which is quite an achievement. So what were your thoughts on the series and what are the big takeaways for both Australia and India?
Yeah, look, I think Australia will be going home, feeling pretty comfortable about the way they performed, especially with the World Cup obviously looming in those exact same conditions later this year. I think like all Australian cricket viewers, we'd have to leave that first game and think to ourselves, here we go, another tour in the subcontinent after a rough start. And, that was kind of the end of it. But the way the Australia fought back, I thought was quite admirable. There are certainly, I think, whilst there were some big highlights, Mitch Marsh is the one I think we've got to talk about first. There are some gaps, I think, that have been papered over. But for me, there are two key takeaways from this, mate. And one was Mitch Marsh, obviously, really stamping himself on the series. And also, Mitch Starc swinging the ball more than I've seen him swing the ball in quite some time, and back to his top of the order stump wreckage, blowing off the front pad kind of carnage that we've come to love with Mitch Starc. So those were the two biggest Australian takeaways for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mitchell Marsh made scores of 81, 66 not out, and 47 across the 3 matches, which was really impressive. Sort of thrown into the top of the order out of circumstance with David Warner not being able to participate in those first 2 matches due to his hairline fracture in his elbow. So it really worked out well for Australia, and it's a pleasant surprise. Do you think it could be a move that Australia does decide to implement moving forward post David Warner, or do you think there are other openers in domestic cricket that could jump up into that position?
Yeah. Look, I think if particularly in those conditions, right? There are certain parts of the world where Marsh opening I'd have, I guess, some sort of issue with. Although if you look at the way the game's gone, I think the idea of picking a one-day opener that's, elite against the moving ball is not necessarily as much of a concern. But I think if you look at the 1-2 tandem of him and Travis Head, they complement each other so well. Obviously, Travis scores quickly, but in a kind of unconventional, lefty kind of timing the ball in his own unique way. And then Mitch Marsh's power game is, up there with the best in the world. So I think at least for the next 6 to 12 months, particularly with the subcontinent, World Cup on the horizon, I think it's pretty sustainable. When you talk about domestic cricket, obviously there's the big Dan Hughes hive of people that are going to sit on that hill until he gets a game for Australia, and I can see why because of the record. But if you ask me, there's no one really blowing the door down. And I think Mitch Marsh is a confidence player. I think they've got to keep backing him in and letting him have a go up the top.
Is someone like a Josh Inglis suitable to opening? Could you have him and Carey in the same side, or do you think they play a bit too similarly? Because they both, play the spinners pretty well. They both like to sweep a lot. But obviously against the new ball, it's a different game most of the time.
I think in the short term, you can have him and Carey in the same team. I think logistically in the long term, they'll end up, probably, I think we'll end up seeing Carey be the long-term test keeper and Inglis feeling out into the one-day role a little bit more. But I think in the short term, there's no problem with that. And quite frankly, again, if you look conditions for conditions, I really like the idea of Inglis batting in the middle order, when the ball's spinning. I think the way he takes the game on against the spinners is certainly a dynamic I think we need. It's just a matter of can we get him enough reps in that role, because it's going to be, real kind of baptism of fire, I think, if he doesn't play a lot of one-day cricket in those conditions between now and the World Cup, and then is expected to average, 35 to 40 in the middle, going at a good speed during the World Cup. So I think the potential's there, but I think we need to pick a strategy now and just kind of stick to it, because a lot of chopping and changing probably isn't best for anyone. Although, there's obviously a conversation about guys like Maxwell and what sort of role they have to play going forward. But I do think there are spots up for grabs for someone like Inglis, especially in that middle order.
Yeah, well, we've talked about the Mitchell Marsh, and now we're going to talk about his opening partner in Travis Head, who made an impressive contribution in the second match, which allowed Australia to chase that total down and win by 10 wickets in VZAG. But how do you see his game potentially moving into the World Cup? Because I thought after being dropped for that first test, he's done everything that you could have asked for of him, and he scored really well and played in that nice aggressive manner that we did see in the Australian summer. And his form in one-day cricket over the last 12 months has been pretty impressive.
And I think that the key thing here, and you obviously talked about him being dropped from the Test team to start that Border Gavaskar Trophy. If you take out really his poor performances last winter in the subcontinent, his last 18, 24 months of international cricket, or probably even more than that, almost 30 months now, dating back to when he really came on the scene, has been superb. I think he's stopped necessarily worrying about his technique or how he's trying to look, and just leaned into playing Travis Head cricket. And quite frankly, I think that this is a perfect role for him, not just in the subcontinent. I mean, we saw what he did in the Australian summer as well, so up the top in the one-day team. So no, I think it's a perfect role for him. I think he'd be a very strange kind of batter to bowl at, and on those short boundaries in the subcontinent, with the way he kind of pierces his gaps, through the offside, I think that he could give some opening bowlers real headaches up the top there.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised he's not playing IPL after the summer that he's had, but maybe he could be signed as a replacement player with, lots of injuries that tend to happen over the course of a really long tournament. Let's talk about Mitchell Starc. Best figures of 5 for 53 off 8 overs in the second ODI. As you mentioned at the top of the show, mate, he was swinging the ball. He was getting that ball to hoop, trapping blokes in front, bowling stumped out of the ground. I think this is a really positive sign for Australia heading into the World Cup once again. But he's been the leading wicket taker in the last 2 50-over World Cups. And could he do it again for the third time in a row, potentially?
Yeah, I mean, if he bowls like this, I think he's almost bowling better than he did in the last World Cup before this one. I think it was nice to see him, and he's talked about it in the media a little bit about how his seam position has kind of been tweaked a little bit and allowed him to swing the ball a little bit more. But it was nice to see him just causing so much chaos at the top of the order. We know he's probably not going to be maybe quite as quick as he was at his absolute athletic peak, but when he swings the ball from that angle coming back in, and we know what he can do at the death, I think that it depends on the wickets to a certain extent, but he was able to swing the ball in Indian conditions in this series. So I think he's really well poised. I think the fact that, hopefully he'll have a half decent Ashes will obviously be a big part of that as well, because, we know he is also a confidence player. But I have extreme confidence in Mitch Starc. When you look at the fast bowling, tent poles of this Australian one-day team, he's probably the guy I think we still look to, when we really need to get the job done.
And one of the big talking points out of the series was the captaincy of Steve Smith. Now, I've been a big believer that he should be Australia's captain in Test and one-day international cricket. Do you share that opinion, or do you think that Cummins should be that leader long-term, or at least for the next sort of, 12 to 24 months?
Test cricket, I think there's an element of when Pat's fit, we know he's going to play every game. And so I think there's an element of not necessarily unsettling the change room dynamic there. But I think if, particularly if we isolate the one-day team, I think the Cricket Australia would be perfectly justified in saying, look, they want Steve Smith to captain, so that gives them more flexibility around, resting Pat Cummins for certain series, obviously being a fast bowler. But also, everyone thinks that Test cricket is in theory the hardest game to captain because it goes over a long period of time and it's very tactical. the stress of captaining a one-day team whilst bowling, you've got fielding restrictions, guys coming in and out. I actually think it's almost harder for a bowling captain to do in a one-day setting than it is in a test setting. So it's a little bit of sitting on the fence. Tactically, Steve Smith is the best captain that we have. I think we all know that. I think Pat Cummins probably knows that. But I think continuity-wise, I'd like to see Smith take over the one-day team and leave Cummins in his chair in the test team as currently constructed.
And speaking of Steve Smith, how long do you think he has left in the one-day game? I'm personally of the belief that I think he'll look at moving on from one-day cricket post the World Cup in India and, concentrate on Test cricket with the time that he has left. But what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I guess I'm going to throw the question back on you here as the host a little bit. But do you think he's at this point of his career, a better one-day or T20 player?
I'd still say he's a better one-day player. Obviously, we've seen what he can do when he is given a proper opportunity in a T20 team with the Sydney Sixers. Things have kind of fallen off he's kind of fallen off the T20 circuit a little bit, not playing IPO anymore. He's signed a county deal to go and play with Sussex for 3 games before the Ashes and the World Test Championship final. So, I think Steve Smith would be better off just becoming a red ball specialist, but you do want the best players to play for as long as possible. But we'll move on to some good news stories. And I think Sean Abbott is one of the good news stories of this tour. Obviously, it's been a tough time for him, and he's been able to bounce back since, the events of late 2014 with Phil Hughes. And I thought he was fantastic in the second ODI. He bowled 6 overs. He took 3 for 23. It's his best figures in one-day cricket for Australia. And I think it's just a good reward for him after some excellent Big Bash form over probably the last 3 years in particular. I've really noticed him in Big Bash. Obviously, he's one of the leading wicket takers in Big Bash cricket, but it's great to see him transfer that form into the international game. And another one, I thought Nathan Ellis was really good in the second ODI as well. He bowled 5 overs. He took 2 for 13. I think he should be a pretty consistent player in Australia's T20 side. But it's good to see those blokes getting opportunities without Hazelwood and Cummins being able to take part in this series.
Yeah, I think Abbott has always been appealing in the sense that he's a little bit different than a lot of the other bowlers we tend to see come out of the Australian domestic system, right? He's quick, but not in this, hit the deck hard, heavy ball kind of way. He's got a slightly unusual action. Obviously, he's got an ability to reverse the ball. He's more of a reverse swing bowler than a conventional swing bowler, but also the fact that he's got his changes of pace aren't anything special. It's not like when AJ Tye was revolutionizing the knuckleball and things like that, but his changes of pace do seem to be a little bit difficult to pick, but also quite sticky in those kind of dry wickets as well. So I like him because I think he's cut from a different cloth as far as the kind of bowling that we're used to producing in Australia, which is lent more and more to test cricket and less from, one-day cricket. But also the fact that he does something a little bit different, and hey, he's bowling all-rounder, but he can bat a little bit, which helps. Nathan Ellis is an interesting one. Obviously domestically slightly a late bloomer coming on the scene kind of in his mid to late 20s as a fast bowler. I certainly think that he's got potential up the top. I think he bowls quite sharp. Obviously, it was great to see him blow off Virat Kohli's front pad in that big win that we had. But no, I think from a certain extent he's good, but I'm not yet sold on Nathan Ellis at the highest level. I can still see a world where he could be cannon fodder in the wrong kind of scenario with his pace on the bat. But certainly one to keep an eye on, and someone I'd like to see for the squad for the next couple of series.
Yeah, I think Nathan Ellis should be really in that squad for Australia's T20 team in particular. I'm still thinking that he might be a little bit off in the one-day team, but I think he's a handy replacement for Cummins, Stark, Hazelwood, those main bowlers that we've already had over the last few years. But let's talk about India now. We've focused a lot on Australia. Surya Kumar Yadav had one of the worst series you could possibly imagine. It reminds us of a friend of ours who we will not name on this show for the sake of his pride, but 3 Golden Ducks in a row for a bloke that is on the fringes in India's one-day team. It's very concerning, but we do know what type of player Sky is and how damaging he can be, as we've seen it in the World Cup here in Australia, even though it's T20. His white ball cricket over the last 12 months has been simply a joy to watch, but a disappointing series for Surya Kumar Yadav. And how can he get out of this form slump?
Look, it's a tough one, right? We've all gone through lean patches, but to get three first ballers. Not only that, he actually didn't hit a ball all series. If you look at his dismissals, which is, I'm sure that doesn't feel great, but you mentioned it. His last 12 months have been really strong, and this is the interesting thing with World Cup squads, right? Where I'm not sure if ICC have released the information yet, but historically, the ICC rules around World Cup squads have been, on the smaller end. If you talk 15, 16 players. Which makes it really tough. There's often guys that miss out. And I think, prior to this series, you would have thought his name was kind of penciled in to be a World Cup player for India. But this certainly does leave an element of doubt, which is a shame. But at the same point in time, you'd like to think that there's an element of, isolating this as a three game series and moving on from him. But, he is 32. So it's kind of now or never for a player like him to make sure that the next time he goes out, puts the padders on for India here, he shows obviously better than this, but that he's a World Cup player as well. But I think he'll bounce back. I think this was just a mixture of a couple of good balls and some bad form.
Yeah, well, he got dismissed by Stark twice in the series, 2 times LBW with balls that moved back a long way, and then just missed a sliding arm ball from Agar last night. So Hardik Pandya as well. Good to see him take some wickets. Didn't have a massive contribution with the bat. Unfortunately, wasn't presented the greatest of opportunities, particularly in that first game. But the fact that he was able to take 3 wickets in that third ODI is really promising for India. And if he can bowl somewhere between 6 to 7 overs per game, it really allows India a lot of flexibility if one of their bowlers is getting targeted. And at the same time, if he can manage to bowl all 10 overs of his allocated overs, I should say, it might allow India to play an extra batsman or an extra all-rounder. India have so much depth in their team, and it's just good to see someone who's had a lot of injury problems do really well. So what are your thoughts on Hardik Pandya? And do you think he's set for a good IPL as well with the Gujarat Titans?
Yeah, I mean, Pandya's bowling interesting, right? Because I think we all recognise that when he's 100% healthy and kind of locked in, I think he's, a genuine frontline bowler. I think there's definitely been patches in his career where he hasn't been 100% healthy and bowling. It actually reminds me a lot of Ben Stokes in a similar way, where depending on what series or what game you tune into, the depth of what you think of him as a bowler could be drastically different. And I think this is also the weird place we're in now with limited overs cricket, and you can see it in the Australian team as well, is that we're at a point now where it's not uncommon for like 6 all-rounders to be in one team, which is really bizarre when you talk about what your role is, both with bat and ball. But also, I mean, selectors must be really strange, some of these selection meetings, compared to how simple it would have been 20 years ago. But I think, obviously, I think Pandya, he definitely, if you ask me, he's definitely a big game player, someone that likes the spotlight a little bit. I think he'll play well in the IPL. I wonder if there will be an element of managing his workload a little bit with the ball, although, again, those 4-over stints usually aren't too difficult. And again, when you're talking about playing a World Cup in India, an IPL in India, because of his power game, we know he only has to get 70% of the ball when he goes big with the bat, and it's going to clear the ropes in those kind of conditions. So, no, he's always been a joy to watch. I think it's a shame we haven't seen more of him at the highest level, even Test cricket. I know that's been injuries and form and a few other things, but I'd say he's pretty key. And it's funny, right? You were talking about the Indian bowling. There isn't one player that specifically stands out from the series. Everyone kind of had a decent game here or there. and Jadeja was as tight as always, going at 4 and over. But it was really kind of patchy and on a day-to-day basis as to who was their key guy with the ball. If you transpose that with the Australians and Stark being clearly the weapon.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the spin trio that India put out in this series. So Kuldeep Yadav, Akshar Patel and Jadeja. And I think the three of them together are a really good combination. They're all slightly different. Sure, you've got two left-arm orthodox spinners in Patel and Jadeja, but the way that they bowl is really different and presents a different challenge to the batsman. So how do you see those three bowlers, and is Ravi Ashwin still in consideration for the World Cup, or do you think his time in one-day cricket's up?
So, I mean, Jadeja as well, obviously, like I said, he was really tight with the ball, but also was very handy with the bat this series, and he averaged just tick under 40. Obviously, they've moved him around a little bit with where he bats, and Patel's much the same. Even flowing into the Test series, it felt like at times Patel was one of the batters that struck the most fear into the Australians when he was batting in the Test series. I think 100% that it's going to be Jadeja and Patel in the team sheet almost every game. Yadav's an interesting one. I'm always been a sucker for obviously wrist spin, but obviously a guy that can spin the ball both ways. I think left arm Chinaman still to this day spinning in both ways has got to be one of the hardest things to face when you're trying to score. I would like to see them back him in, pick him consistently, go with the three spinners. There might be certain conditions where that's not possible, but two of your spinners are all-rounders, so you do have some flexibility. So this is actually the team I would have gone with bowling lineup-wise with the three spinners if I am India going forward. I don't necessarily think India lost the series with the way they bowled spin. I think you could much more likely to point to the way they batted or the way their quicks executed. So you talk Ashwin, I think you put him in the squad for the versatility, but if it's me, he's not on my team sheet, for the first game of that World Cup unless something changes.
Yeah, and how do you see India's batting as well? Because Rishabh Pant's unfortunately not available due to his current injury. Shreyas Iyer as well was injured, sustained a back injury in the fourth test. I assume he'll be ready to go for the IPL. But are there any current changes that you would recommend for India? Their depth across all formats is just unbelievable and something that we would dream of here in Australia. But what are your thoughts about the current Indian batting lineup? Because I think they should have got India home in last night's game, but cricket's a funny game sometimes.
Yeah, and right, it was funny because it was Kohli held out on the fence off Agar, didn't he?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. So and it was one of those moments, and sadly we've had a few of these with Steve Smith over the last couple of years where you thought when it happened you were thinking Pete Kohli gets this done, and he at the end of the game you sit there and go, well, he's just too good. And Virat Kohli's obviously still one of the better one-day players in the world, but I think that that was one of those kind of seminal moments where, and maybe I'm over reading into it, but it just felt like for 4 straight years he would have just run that total down and looked completely chanceless. I think that is to a certain extent showing up now with India, where they don't have someone they can necessarily lean on just to dominate. I think obviously they'll get more out of Rohit Sharma than what they got in this series. He scored quickly, but he obviously didn't make all that many runs. It is a tough one. I think that you talk about the IPL. I think this is a perfect chance, for a couple of young Indian batsmen to showcase their wares, right? I think there's a spot or two up for grabs. And we also know, culturally how if you're someone that can go out and succeed in the IPL for, an extended period of time, that's certainly going to put you on the radar of the selectors. So for the first time in a long time, it feels like there's a spot or two up for grabs, if the right young player comes out and really dominates the IPL. And that's a good thing, I think, for Indian cricket, because there are a lot of hungry young cricketers out there ready to take a spot in a team that's been very hard to get into for the last, 7-8 years now.
Yeah, we've seen Shubman Gill dominate the IPL, come into all 3 teams for India, Tests, One Days and T20s, and just show his class. There's lots of Indian batters out there, so the IPL this year will be a telling one. Lewis, let's quickly talk about Australia's selection this series. So you mentioned to me off air that 6 blokes played all 3 games for Australia. which I find quite concerning considering that we're only 6 or 7 months out from the World Cup. And leading into a World Cup, you want your team to be really settled? Or do you think this series was a little bit about Australia finding out some more information about, some blokes that might be on the fringe of the squad? We talk about Abbott, we talk about Ellis. Inglis played the first game but wasn't seen after that. And the injury to Glenn Maxwell, I believe, flared up after the first game, but I could be wrong there. So what are your thoughts about Australia's team going forward? And David Warner batting at 4, that was a strange decision to me because I feel like he either opens or he doesn't play one-day cricket.
Yes, I mean, a bit to unpack there. If I start with Warner at 4, I definitely agree with you. I think pretty much in every format now we've seen, exception of maybe some experimenting in T20, he just never looks the same coming in the middle order. Short of the aesthetic bias of enjoying seeing Warner go out there in the banana floppy number 4, I just don't think there's a lot else there that really does it for me. And quite frankly, especially not in those conditions, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. So it is a tough one. I guess you could say that was forced by how well Marsh and Head have been batting up the top, which is a good thing. I certainly don't think there's going to be, I don't think 3 through 5 in the World Cup is going to be, Smith, Warner, Labuschagne. I don't think you can have all 3 in there. And it does present an interesting scenario, right, where Maxwell, coming back from obviously a fair bit of time out of the game, you'd like to back him in, but he's not someone you necessarily trust to score buckets of runs at 4. So from my end, I guess it'd be good to see some more assurance out of one of Labuschagne or Smith in the next couple of kind of one days we get to play. We obviously know they're world-class players, but both of them have had peaks and troughs at the one-day level. Because at the moment, and we saw it in this series, quite frankly, I have some level of concern about, what's happening after the 3 spot. I think we're good kind of 6 through 9 because we've got so many of those guys like, Stoinis and Maxwell and guys like that can come and just slap it down the lower order. And I think we'd all love Cam Green to be the answer. But again, he was someone that looked like he didn't have a key role in this series, despite playing 2 games. He bowled a lot, didn't bowl all that well. Didn't obviously make that many runs. So I think the middle order is really hard to determine at the moment. And I think the selectors may have to make a choice between name and reputation and young guys with flair like Josh Inglis and Cam Green. And it's going to be a really tough selection. But I think other than up the top, we've got a lot of questions to answer from the batting side of things, at least.
Yeah, Australia's selection is of concern to me leading into that World Cup, but I'm sure we can unpack that another time. Let's quickly preview the IPL. The tournament kicks off in a few days, and I've got the Rajasthan Royals as my champions this year. I had Delhi slightly higher, but I think with a couple of Delhi and Mumbai slightly higher. But with a couple of injuries to some key players, I've had them drop. So I've got Lucknow in 2nd place. I've got Gujarat in 3rd place, and I've got Chennai in 4th place. So those would be my top 4. But we've seen in IPL, it doesn't matter sometimes what your team looks like on paper. It's what you produce out in the middle. And some teams can just gel together really well and surprise you. So who have you got your eye on in this IPL? I just love the balance of Rajasthan's. I know they missed out on Harry Brook and they were really keen to get him, but Jason Holder's a great addition. And you don't change a team that's going as well as they did last year. I know they lost to Gujarat in the final, but it was really impressive what I saw from Rajasthan. So they're my top pick at the moment. What about you, mate?
Yeah, look, I kind of like the look of the Delhi Capitals. It's an interesting one, but I just, if I'm looking from my end, I guess I think it's a nice balanced squad. I like the local guys they went with. Obviously, we talked about, I talked about how much I like, Kuldeep Yadav, but also, people like, someone like Mitch Marsh, obviously coming off the back end of a really good series. Again, I think I'm a bit of a sucker for, some of the pace they've got in their lineup as well. I'm leaning Delhi Capitals, but I'm not very much not confident in that. And I mean, the other one I kind of look at is the Gujarat Titans, depending on health and fitness a little bit. But it feels like a really balanced tournament. I certainly think compared to some of the years gone past, it's quite hard to put your finger on, who necessarily you think is going to win. And quite frankly, I think that if you look at I haven't looked at them. I looked at them a couple of days ago, but I think the betting odds actually somewhat represent that as well. It's a pretty flat kind of talent distribution. So no, for me, like I said, leaning probably Delhi, but I can't say I have a resounding amount of confidence in that pick.
I had Hyderabad in 10th position, and a few of the followers on social media got stuck into me thinking that their team should be placed higher, but they've got Aiden Markram as captain. As you mentioned, Gujarat, they were able to pick up Kane Williamson for 2 crore, which is cheap considering his price last year was 12 with Sunrisers Hyderabad. So the IPL will be a very fascinating competition when it kicks off, and we will be covering that on the channel. Hopefully you might be able to join me for a few episodes. But Lewis, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for joining me in the Cordon. It's always great to catch up with you, and thank you so much to our listeners at home for tuning in. Thanks to ORTC Clothing Co. and Ray White Henley Beach for supporting this episode. Lewis, thanks for joining me, mate. Great to chat with you.
No, pleasure coming on. Look forward to some good IPL cricket, and hopefully we didn't drop too many sodas between the two of us today.
Absolutely. Hopefully it was a good chat, and hopefully our listeners at home had a good time. Make sure that you like, follow, and subscribe to our social media pages, and we'll see you on the next episode of In the Cordon.